Moreno. Joe, what is your takeaway from this ruling? Because as I understand it, McGann, if he does appear to testify, which this ruling compels him to do, he could still go there and plead immunity.
That's right, Michelle. So basically, what this means is that the theory of absolute immunity, which is something that President Trump did not come up with himself. It's been kicking around since the 1970s. Basically, it says that the executive branch should be immune from being compelled to testify by the legislative branch because they are co-equal. And that being compelled makes them subordinate, and therefore the president and his closest advisors should be immune. The judge last night, Judge Jackson, said, wait a minute, not so fast. You can still assert privilege, right? There are certain privileges like executive privilege and attorney-client privilege. That's fine. And there are parameters around those privileges, and they can still be asserted within reason. However, absolute immunity is just not tenable, because otherwise, how would Congress fulfill its obligation to legislate and investigate and conduct oversight of the executive branch if it cannot even reach people it needs to hear from? So basically, privileges still exist, privileges may still be asserted, but the concept of immunity, basically saying, I don't even need to show up and testify, that has been essentially, blown out of the water by this judge, and it will be very difficult for others to argue it going forward.
I just want to bring in a tweet now from President Trump in which he talks about this basically in the context of, he says, he's fighting for future presidents and the office of the president. Other than that, I would actually like people to testify. Obviously this is bigger than the immediate impeachment inquiry, and it is a question of separation of powers between Congress and the president's office. But how does this affect things going forward in terms of other witnesses we might see?
Well, so to your point, Judge Jackson's ruling does not directly affect other witnesses. So it doesn't mean that others like John Bolton, who's a former executive branch official, or others like Mike Pompeo, who are currently in the executive branch, they could still assert it. And they could, bring it to other judges and see if those other judges rule differently. So they could try to do it. But now we've had in our history 2 different district courts over the last 10 years rule that this concept of absolute immunity is really not sustainable. So it's going to be more difficult because courts like to side with other courts once there's been precedent. And of course, appealing it also has its kind of harmful factors, because if a higher court agrees with Judge Jackson, especially if it goes to the Supreme Court, then literally no one can raise this going forward. So the Trump administration has to be careful, because they may buy themselves some time by appealing this decision, but if they get a decision that's not good for them, it could affect not just them, but future presidents going forward.
There's a decision as well, Joe, isn't there, for the Democrats, because they want to get this wrapped up in the House before year end so it can be passed on to the Senate. We're just getting a line here that the Judiciary Committee will hold its first hearing on December the 4th. Does that suggest that they're not going to wait for the appeal on Don McGahn or look to bring in any of the others on the subpoenas, just get on with it and put through the articles of impeachment?
Christian, I think that's right. There's no possible way, if we're going to have hearings starting next week and articles of impeachment drafted in December and possibly voted on by the end of the year, it's impossible to then also at the same time wait for 1, possibly 2 levels of appellate courts to weigh in on the Don McGahn case. So I think you're right. Democrats, if they want to stick with this timetable, just simply cannot wait for the courts to decide this or the various other issues before different district courts regarding other witnesses.
Okay, Joe, stay there for us, would you? Because I want to touch on another story with you. The White House decision to fire Navy Secretary Richard Spencer over this handling of the case of a Navy SEAL demoted for misconduct. We touched on it yesterday in the programme. Now, clearly Donald Trump is on the side of the SEAL in question. This is what he tweeted today. I'll always protect our great war fighters. I've got your backs. But this is what Richard Spencer had to say in an interview with CBS.
I don't think he really understands the full definition of a warfighter. A warfighter is a profession of arms, and a profession of arms has standards that they have to be held to, and they hold themselves to.
I think you're a veteran, aren't you, Joe?
I am, yes.
Yeah, so you served in the military. How do you feel about the president's intervention?
Well, we have, the military is one of the largest bureaucracies we have, and that goes for the military justice system as well. There are many, many levels of review that go into whether it's a courts-martial or an administrative action designed to do things like promote or demote or take away someone's status or retirement, such as the case here. So at the end of the day, though, the president is the commander-in-chief. And so what the president has basically done is reached into the military in his role as the commander, bypassed all of those various levels of review and appeal and deliberation, and basically said, this is the way I want it. So he has the legal authority to do that. I mean, he has absolute authority when it comes to the military. But at the same time, you're going to ruffle feathers because you're dealing with a large, old, established bureaucracy that has its ways of doing things. So I'm not surprised one bit that by President Trump's actions, while legally he's on solid ground, he is not going to make many in the military happy, because it's setting a precedent that a president can basically ignore all of that goes on at the military structure and do whatever he or she wants.
Joe Moreno in Washington, thank you so much. The president there shattering another norm.